Everybody, welcome to another episode of Carry On Friends, the Caribbean American podcast. I'm excited to have you. I'm excited when people I know meet a road and talk to a couple times come on the podcast. So my guest today is Renee. Renee, listen, we've been parring a couple times over the summer. So welcome to the podcast. How are you?
Thank you, Carrie. I'm well, thanks. I'm well. Happy to be here.
Awesome. All right. So, why don't you tell the community of friends a little bit about who you are, Caribbean country you represent, what you do, and all that good stuff?
Oh, sure. Well, my name is Renee Kendall. I am an attorney. I am a native to New York, specifically Brooklyn, descendant of Trinidadian migrant parents, so hence the Caribbean American connection there, and deeply connected and committed to the Caribbean community based here in New York. So that's me in a nutshell. I have been in practice for a couple of years now, but have been a member of the legal community here in New York for quite some time. Launched a solo practice a couple of years ago, focused primarily on estate planning, real estate matters, and assisting people with advocacy matters.
All right, cool. We're going to get into that. Renee, you really fulfill your parents' dreams to pick from the top five career paths. I mean, lawyer, doctor,
Yes,
So tell
yes.
me what it's like growing up second generation to Trinidadian immigrants in New York City. Tell me what was that like.
Oh, wow. So, although I am born and raised here in New York, I did spend a part of my formative years in Trinidad. So, I think from the ages of maybe 2 to almost 8 years old, I spent in Trinidad. So, that is where my first memories would have formed. That's where I learned to walk and talk and all of that. So, it is poured into my foundation. When I came to New York, it was almost like I was a new person. It was almost like I was a migrant, even though I was born right here in New York. So many aspects of American culture are being introduced to me for the first time at the age of 8, which is sort of good because it means I remember most of it, right? So I remember what New York felt like and sounded like. And we're talking, I don't want to date myself, but let's say Reagan was president. And it was a unique experience, I think, amongst my peers, because at that time I didn't have as many Caribbean peers or Caribbean American peers. One distinct thing I remember my parents saying growing up is that outside is America. You come into this house, we're in Trinidad. And that essentially meant was that we were, under sort of Trinidad rules, right? Like my parents were migrant and they maintained and retained lots of their customs, heritage practices. My parents spoke with thick Trinidadian accents, although they lived and worked here in America. The values they believed they shared from their parents, my grandparents, are what they used to raise us, although they were doing it in this environment. So it was a little bit different for me, I think, than some of my peers. There were the times where what we were learning outside, and even sometimes in classrooms, was in direct conflict with what we were taught and knew to be the right thing from our home life. So that's a little bit about what it was like to grow up as a Caribbean American here in Brooklyn, New York, where sometimes the environment wasn't as friendly, and sometimes the experiences inside our home and outside our home weren't as cohesive, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point that you made where I think a lot of people have experiences being born here and spent time growing up in the Caribbean. I know I've done that to my daughter. She spent at least a year living in Jamaica, right? And then I think that because we're in a place where everybody is flags everywhere, people don't remember when there was a time when it wasn't flags everywhere. And
Right.
I understand that I moved to New York at a time when everyone wanted to be Jamaican and have flags
Ah,
everywhere. So
nice.
I think I want to do an episode that explores before Brooklyn was Caribbean, because
Yes.
it wasn't always this like
No,
representative and proud out loud,
no,
type thing.
no.
So Let me write that down before I forget it.
Mm-hmm.
Because um I feel like in our conversations, unknowingly we misrepresent that Brooklyn has always been this way. So people who do not live in the New York area or Brooklyn or anywhere else on the Northeast might feel like they're in the Midwest or in some other state, and it's not like
Yes.
represent your flag. Then it's like something's
Yes.
wrong. But it wasn't always the case for us here on the East Coast. So go ahead.
Definitely not. I remember, migrating from an environment like Trinidad. You're 8 years old. We wore uniforms to school. We wore ribbons in our hair. And I was a child who loved ribbons, and I loved to tell my mom how I wanted my hair. And I remember coming home after we migrated to New York and coming home from school crying, telling my mom, don't put ribbons in my hair anymore. The children make fun of me, they torture me, right? So this thing that I was once so proud of, this thing that was a symbol, right, of who you were, so to speak. Because remember, we did ribbons to match our uniforms. We didn't have uniforms in New York, so I did ribbons to match whatever I was wearing. I probably looked absolutely ridiculous, like probably a bit like a clown, but without my knowing it, it was carrying my heritage. And so I learned to hide that. I also masked my accent because, again, I learned to speak in Trinidad, right? So by the time I came here, I have a thick Trinidadian accent. And the kids were unkind as they were. They didn't mean anything by it. They were kids. They didn't have a context for me. They didn't have a context for the ribbons and the way I spoke and the foods I ate. So what was born out of that was torture.
Yeah, I think, man, we definitely have to go into that in another episode about the accent and or
Yes.
before we became normalized. And there's still ways to
Right.
go, but we weren't normalized for a very long
No.
time.
No.
So thank you
No.
for sharing that. Um,
You're welcome.
and definitely it's going to be a list for 2023 for sure.
Hmm.
So one of the reasons why I've asked Renee to be on the podcast is because Renee has listened to the podcast and she heard the episode of me talking about my dad. And I was like, this is perfect. So if you're new to listening to the podcast, a few months ago, I talked about my dad passing in Jamaica and how challenging it was to plan a funeral from the US in Jamaica and having to deal with the affairs of a deceased person from afar. And one of the things that I had said at the end of the episode was don't wait until a family member passes. If you have family back in the Caribbean, wherever that is, get to planning, whatever that is, you got to look about your affairs. And so as I was talking to Renee, I was like, I should have you come on the podcast. So before we get to that specific thing, let's talk about exactly your company, what your company
Hmm.
does, and all that good stuff.
Sure. So in I want to say maybe 2019, we created this company, at least conceptually, and named it Caribbean Legal Solutions. And our goal in that case was to connect the Caribbean Americans residing here in the United States, and really out anywhere in the world outside of the Caribbean, with attorneys that were based in the Caribbean. We found that there was a need for people to find reliable, trustworthy attorneys based in many times their home countries. And that because so many of us have migrated, 10, 20, 30 years we've been here, but we retain connection to the countries either through land ownership or family relationships or traveling back and forth. But in some way, or shape, or form, you have a connection to the country that necessitates the need for an attorney. So we found that there isn't a whole lot out there in terms of resources. When clients don't use a company like ours, they're using the word of mouth network, or they're jumping online and doing, using a search engine to find an attorney. And we just figured there has to be a better way because through the word of mouth network or a search engine, you're not getting true vetting, right? nor are you getting a sense of accountability or peace of mind. And we wanted to create something that would give our clients just that. One, it took away the need to go searching, right? You contact our company, I almost immediately, from listening to you, know what you need and have a person in mind for you, right? And where I don't, I do the search. And I'd like to think that my searching, or I work with a team of attorneys, is probably slightly different than just using word of mouth or jumping online, because we are attorneys that hire attorneys, right? Our methods are slightly different, our terminology is slightly different. So we thought that would be value add to our clients, where we're reducing their work, right? And taking out a lot of guesswork out of it, because we're doing it. We're standing in that gap between where you are here. Let's say you're in New York, and let's say a Guyana and a Grenada. When clients come to us, they have a name and a face and a person that they can interact with, whether they physically walk in and speak with me, or they're talking to me over the phone. It is for them, I think, a lot better, a lot easier sell to hire me than it is to hire someone abroad. So we created the company for that, and many other purposes. We have since evolved because we found that many clients, in addition to needing referrals to attorneys outside of the country, many of them asked us if we had someone right here, right, for their landlord tenant matter, for their immigration matter, divorce, whatever it may be. And I did not get focused on doing local referrals, because I felt like there was just so many companies that did it, so many avenues, right? But we found that clients appreciated that aspect. So there was this need for local referrals. We increased our local network of attorneys as well. And here we are.
Awesome. So, what kind of services are people coming to you for, not from a local perspective, but particularly, the ones back to the region? And how far is the reach? What countries are you currently servicing?
I could probably tell you about 90% of it falls into two categories: land and around an estate matter. Someone died. Someone died here in the United States and has property or affairs or beneficiaries in the Caribbean, or someone died in the Caribbean and the person is located, the beneficiary or the surviving loved one is here in the United States. So that's one. And then oftentimes people own property or should own property, but they don't necessarily know where the deed is, or they're putting their affairs in order, hopefully and prayerfully, that's what they're doing. And they're seeking to have that piece of property left to someone in a will, or to deeding it over to someone else. That's a bulk of what's done. We then have a couple of people who need to sometimes get divorced from someone who's in a Caribbean country that they can't find, right? So we have those matters, those come up every now and then. We've had one or two persons who have, this one is a one of these unpleasant matters, but I'll share it. Sometimes we've had children that live in the Caribbean, and the parent is seeking child maintenance from a person that lives in another country. We assist with things like that as well. So, as you can see, it sort of runs the gamut, but a primary source of our business comes from land matters and estate matters. As far as our reach, we do quite a bit of work. We get quite a bit of requests for attorneys in Jamaica. We've done work in Jamaica, Trinidad, Guyana, Grenada, Barbados. Recently, I did just one a matter in Dominica, Dominican Republic, and St. Vincent.
All right. So, land matters, estate matters. I think those are the typical things, those outliers around getting child support or divorce. Interesting. They're unique, but I do tend to find that a lot of issues, even before I was living in the US, there was always some family argument or mix up about land and dead left, you know?
Mhm.
Yes. Yeah. So
Yes.
so it's like
Yes.
then all of this comes part of, I shouldn't say all of it, because it's not all the time someone dying causes land matters, but it also feels like that's the only time it becomes an issue. So let us first talk about wills and what the Caribbean community should be doing to get into the habit or understand the importance of creating a will. And let's actually address some of the misconceptions around a will. So let's start there.
Oh, thank you. Let's talk about some of the misconceptions with will. Before I do that, Carrie, if you don't mind, I just want to state that nothing in this podcast should be communicated as legal advice. Nothing in here forms an attorney client relationship. If you have specific questions about your specific matter, you please contact us and I will go ahead and provide our contact information towards the end, or your own attorney. So, that said, let's talk about some of the myths around estate planning. Myth number one: writing a will, doing an estate plan will in no way, shape, or form accelerate your death. You will not die because you created a will. I have seen this. This is my area of law. It does not happen. That's one thing. And I say this because oftentimes I have not myself, but I'll have clients come to me. They're trying to get their elderly parent, mom or dad, to write a will, and the parent immediately says, "Are you trying to kill me? Do you want to get the house before I die?" That sort of thing. That's number one. The other thing around wills is, and depending on the country you're talking about, there are some countries that when you write the will, there are certain people within your family that you cannot write out of a will, right? They inherit regardless of what you write. And for some countries, that's a spouse, like the jurisdiction like New York. And in other jurisdictions, you can't disinherit a child. Again, nothing here is legal advice, but feel free to give us a call and we'll talk about your specific situation. So I'm only mentioning it here to say that there shouldn't be a belief that if you're writing a will, if someone wrote the will, they're trying to disinherit someone, right? That's not necessarily the case. The other thing is that wills or creating an estate plan, it does not have to be as expensive as one might believe. I think that is a huge hurdle, mental hurdle, in seeing an attorney and having an estate plan put to paper. It's absolutely something that should not be avoided. It should absolutely, be prioritized. And I'll say this: my firm and the company does quite a bit of what's called estate administration. Estate administration is a process offered to the loved ones of a deceased person who has not done a will. Unfortunately, we see a lot more state administration than we do wills because, our community, there just isn't a lot of estate planning. So we're often forced to go through the administration process. That is expensive. It is also time consuming. Now, I mention this to say because I deal with grieving families, right? So, in many cases, my clients are the surviving loved ones of someone who died. They're dealing with trying to put affairs like a funeral together. Hopefully, they're not trying to do it from another country because, again, I'll let Carrie talk a little bit about what that experience is like. So, trying to do it from a foreign country is also extremely difficult. They're dealing with that. They themselves are grieving. And then, oftentimes, unfortunately, fighting almost immediately starts when someone dies. So, amidst all of that, right, some of those things we can help with, some of the things we can't, right? Family dynamic is not something we specialize in. But amidst all of that, you want to avoid having to also deal with unnecessary paperwork, right? If you have an attorney involved prior to, right, death is inevitable, everyone. I hope that's not a news flash for everyone. Um, if you have an attorney who you've been working with and someone dies unexpectedly, you have someone that you can almost sort of throw the ball to. They know exactly what to do. They're already in your family dynamics. You've put things in place and they can take a huge burden off of you while you focus on, the emotional aspect of things. So it is something I absolutely encourage every single person to do, and to please consult an attorney before you do so.
you said something that, I mean, people might experience it, but you put a name to it. The idea of writing a will is confronting your mortality, and that's a
Yes.
fear, right?
Yeah.
That gives anxiety, and is like, you don't want to deal with this. You don't want to confront that one day you're going dead, even though you know it. The act of doing something towards it makes you want to. I don't want to talk about this. I don't want to deal
Yes.
with this.
Yes.
One of my first encounters with a will was when my great grandmother passed away, and she lived in Canada. And every winter she came to Jamaica, or she went to Jamaica, because of course it's cold for her. She was up in age. So, she packed our multiple barrels, send them to Jamaica because she was going to be in Jamaica until it warm up in Canada.
Hmm.
And she so happened to pass away during one of those winter December trips. So she passed away in Jamaica. She had a will, and she had 9 kids, plus
Wow.
plenty grandkids and great grandkids,
Hmm.
myself included. My grandmother's one of her 9, but she had a will, and, there were some disagreements about what should be happening, as always, even though in my mind, I was like, my family peaceful. We're not those people, but there was a disagreement about who should
Yes.
get something. And I
Right.
don't know if it's the grief or the emotion that's taking over, but something very primal happens in that period. And so a will, you know, is important. And only because I worked in legal, so I know this other part. It's important because you don't want people to say, "Oh, you forced mama to write the will," and
Exactly.
and convince
Exactly.
her to push me out or give you more of this or give you more of that. And so I think having an attorney is a neutral party, and the attorney is going to assess if you're in your right state of mind and all these other things, right?
Yes.
You
Yes.
don't want to, I mean, I guess you can rewrite a will if you're upset, but a good attorney may not want to say that's the best decision to make.
Right.
So, talk to me a little bit more about, for anyone listening, how they could go about making the first step, getting over that anxiety around confronting this mortality. What's the first step that you can do that maybe is committed but non-committed that you can do? Maybe it's
Sure.
calling you or something, I don't know.
It might be your first step, calling the attorney. I think for some folks, getting over it or getting to that place mentally is a first step. And here's what I would say to someone if they're not going to call an attorney and they're not going to do a will. At the very least, gather your documents. Gather your documents, have them in an envelope, right? One of the things I give to my clients is a form that writes out the names of persons that you know. Means that if something happened to you, I don't know, for example, who you deal with at the bank, but the person at the bank knows your affairs. They know you, right? So if you give me that, you write down that point person, I come and I say, hey, I'm Carrie Ann's sister. Now that banker has knowledge that I don't have, and you, unfortunately, Carrie, may be incapacitated, unable to speak. They can help. They can help and guide, right? So I have a form. You write down things like your banker, the person you deal with at their insurance company, the person who holds forms, you know, people that you deal with that your friends and family don't know that you deal with, and these are like business partners, so to speak. Each of us has a team, right? Um, your affairs should be in order, best you can, in an envelope, right? All together. If you have a safe deposit box, that's also very helpful. Um, Account numbers, or oftentimes when people come to me, they don't even know where their mom had money, right? So even if you're not going to get all of that in a succinct document like a will or a trust, if you wrote it down on a piece of paper, so that if something happens to you, your family then knows at least where to start. It's extremely helpful to us once we get involved. When I think about important documents, people tend to will have an envelope, but it'll have things like their birth certificate, a passport, their permanent resident card, or their naturalization certificate, things like that. But they don't think about putting those things in an envelope like that. that others don't know or don't have access to. It's your internal knowledge, right? And then we forget that if something happens to us, not just death, but incapacity, right? As we age, we forget things that other people don't know that, right? You could potentially die with that information that others need. Something else I recently started adding, well, lawyers started adding to estate plans are passwords and access to your digital devices. I write into wills. If something happens to me, my daughter, if she has to go to T-Mobile or wherever she is permitted, I give her access to whatever, all of my information. That's extremely helpful if something happens to you, because we can start putting the pieces of the puzzle together if for some reason you did not leave an estate plan. So that's the first step. Step two, which really should be step one, speak with an attorney, someone like myself. And I think what's important for our community in coordinating with a firm like mine or a company like Caribbean Legal Solutions is that we understand the nuances of doing estate planning across borders. So I don't necessarily write a New York will to dispose of property in Grenada, right? I know that I need to do a consultation with my Grenadian counterpart to figure out the best way to dispose of that property if someone dies. Because what we don't want is to have someone write a will based in New York law, probate that will in a New York court, and then take that document to Grenada and try to get the property that's left. It's just, there are better ways to do it. Let's say that.
Yes, yes, yes. As you were talking, I was so glad you got to the digital part, because when my little brother used to work at the Apple store, he would
Mm-hmm.
say that people would come to the Apple store to try to get a
Mm-hmm.
device open, the laptops open,
Mm-hmm.
because of the death of a family member.
Mm-hmm.
So, as you were saying that, I was like, yeah, family members have access. I have access to my mom's account. But the other point that you said is that we keep everything in our head, and we take
Yeah.
because it's so second nature and knowledge, we're not
Mm-hmm.
thinking of it as anything. And I used to think like, oh, people have unclaimed money with the government. I want my money. Me
Right.
not make the government keep my money. But as I get older, I'm like, it's easy to see how the government have unclaimed money. You forget
You
that
forget.
you had money there. So
Mhm.
that's the number one thing you forget. And it's not intentional. You take for granted that you remember everything. And I think that is like the simplest and one of the best advice. Like, gather everything.
Gather
Like,
everything.
as you're saying, I was like, wait, I think I had a saving bond
Yes.
years
Yeah.
ago.
We would
I,
never be able to find that if
oh
you
my
were not
gosh.
around. We would have no record of it.
And not only that, the savings bond issued by the US government, it is hard to get into that account. Like, it had like 10
Mhm.
layers just to
Yes.
try to log into the account. So
Hmm.
that is such a good point, everyone. Listen, I know we're talking about wills, and I know land matters don't only exist around death. I'll get to a question later, but fortunately for myself, my cousins and I weren't squabbling, so they were able to handle some things, like coordinate, and my
Right.
brother and I took care of what we had to take care of. But it was still hard, even though we didn't have that. I was just like, this is rough. And not only that, just the banking across borders is a
Hmm.
whole different beast. All right, the verifications,
Oh yeah.
the for us in the US, we're like, why the bank can't just do this? And in the Caribbean, they're like, no, we need it snail mail. you know
Right.
do
Right.
this.
So that brings me to another point I wanted to bring up. So oftentimes one of the ways I get people to do and commit to an estate plan is that even if a person can't mentally deal with their mortality, they can often deal with the fact that one day they are going to get old and forget things, or that something could happen to them, a tragic accident that leaves them, without an arm, without vision, without, it does happen, right? For some reason, being hurt is more realistic, right? Advanced directives is something I want to talk to your audience about. And we probably know about advanced directives, but we probably don't know that's what they're called. A power of attorney is something I recommend for every single person above the age of 18. It is a document that allows someone else to act on your behalf in the event that you are unable to, or if you just don't want to. For our community, it becomes especially important because we almost exist in two worlds, right? We are here in the United States, or we're in Canada, or we're in the UK, and then we have affairs like a bank account or retirement or land in the Caribbean. So I encourage my clients to appoint someone now while you're young and coherent and sober minded in that foreign jurisdiction where you may not necessarily be able to travel, to handle your affairs. And there are ways in which you can do it to limit it so that, people are often sort of, oh, someone's going to steal my money. Or the very person they're trusting, their cousin or something, may steal their money. So there are ways in which you can limit it. But why it's of value for Caribbean jurisdictions is that, unlike power of attorneys within, let's say, New York, in a Caribbean country, the power of attorney is filed with the court, right? It's on record there that it exists. So it holds a little bit more weight when you're trying to access like a banking institution and you have this document that says, Kerry has given me authority to transact on her account. Especially when we're having, like, elderly folks, right? Like Kerry gave the example of an older grandmother who lived in Canada. What if something needed to be done for her in Jamaica and she's now 86? Traveling there isn't as, feasible for her. Having had a person appointed in advance to take care of something is of a great value. The other advanced directive I would recommend for every single person is a healthcare proxy. You assign someone to speak on your behalf in the event that you are unable to speak. Let's again think of tragic car accidents; they happen all the time, unfortunately. Um, and someone to make a decision. This is the person that will speak to your healthcare professional, to whom your healthcare professional will take instructions. If you don't put it in place, there's a default sort of familial chart that it goes through, right? If you're married, the doctors take instructions from your spouse. If your spouse is unavailable, the doctors take instructions from your adult siblings and then adult children, and so on and so forth. What happens is that many people, their default person is not the person they want communicating to the doctor. Oftentimes, when we select someone, when I tell people to think carefully about who you want as your healthcare proxy, remember that this person is making a decision in a high stress, sometimes highly emotional context. So you want to think about the person who can think clearly in that sort of context and appoint them now while you're feeling fine, and put that on record with your healthcare professional, with your union, with your health insurance company. You want to do that now. So these are two key things our community can benefit from. I do a lot of work on the other side of it when I have clients that come to me with elderly parents who didn't put anything in place, and they're forgetting things, and they are missing, or they left the fire on or something, and they're trying to get assistance for this elderly parent, but they're unable to do things like just come in and make decisions for them, right? Until someone has been designated by the court that they're no longer able to make decisions, no one else takes decisions about them. The bank will only take instructions from an account holder, no one else. You can go into a bank and scream that your 85-year-old parent should not be making these decisions. They'll give away their money, or something like that. They still will not listen to you. So it's best to put these things in place sooner rather than later. And those are the two key advanced directives that we would recommend.
Renee, thank you for that. But also, when I was in paralegal school, the minute I
Mhm.
left paralegal school, I had a will in place, and I was pretty
Yes.
young. So I don't want us to all feel like we should do this for elderly parents and grandparents,
No.
regardless, like you said, once you're over the age of 18, once you're working, once you have children,
Yes.
these are documents that should be in place,
Yes.
and it's very important. My father was fairly young when he died in January, so it's not something that's limited for the old.
No, no, not
It's
at
young,
all.
and anyone over the age of 18 as an adult should be thinking about their affairs in this way. So I want to shift a little bit because with land, I know a lot of members of the audience, they're looking to go back to Jamaica or anywhere else in the Caribbean to live or to work
Mm-hmm.
remotely
Mm-hmm.
temporarily. Some people even want to buy land and they want to do all of that. Is that in some of the land matters that you handle?
Lots of it. Beyond estate matters or land around when someone passes away, are real estate, right? We have a lot of people based here in the United States who either own property or are looking to own property in their home countries. So we get involved if you're looking to purchase property or sell property, we get involved at the point of where there's a contract. Something that I want to mention that I think will be important for this audience is deed fraud. If you are, looking to purchase property back home, I've just seen so many of these stories where a person is, purporting to be the owner of property somewhere in a Caribbean island and they're selling it. And this person who lives here has been sending money back home. They're paying for it in installments. When we get to a certain point, we find that the person who was collecting this money doesn't own the property, or that the property is somewhat embroiled. It's sort of wrapped up into some other legal matter. One of the ways in which we can be helpful is producing a deed search, right? You want to have clear title before you enter into an agreement to purchase property and start sending money to some person who claims that they own the property. So that's important. We do a bit of that, and then we help once there's a contract between seller and buyer. That's the point at which we get involved.
Think that's the number one concern. People
Hmm.
don't want to be defrauded, and that
Right,
is the thing that they're most concerned about with anything, doing across borders. And
right.
because the Caribbean just operates very differently from the Americanized way of how we do things, we're
That's
just,
one word,
yes,
differently.
yes, we're terrified, you know, of it. I say differently because it doesn't make sense for me to say it's wrong because
Right,
they'll just look at me. It's like, it's just because you're in America, everything go fast. You need to slow down. They'll tell me
right,
that.
right,
So
right.
I'll just say differently at this point. But I really feel like the information you shared is just so valuable. You know, my brothers, my husband, they have the passwords. What happens? I have this podcast. What happens
Yes,
if something happens to me? Can they
right,
log into my website? Can they, do all these different things to effectuate, like, okay, something's wrong with, Carrie Ann. And yeah, I don't want to think I'm going to pass next week, but, it's also part of life. And
right,
it's very important to consider, these options and alternatives. And like I said, when my father passed away, it was the number one thing I said to the audience. If you have family still living in the Caribbean and you're caring for them back home, you have to have something in place, whether it's life insurance, whatever it is.
hmm,
You're already paying medical bills or whatever it is, might as
right,
well get the legal documentation in place and continue the relationship with a professional that can help you navigate what happens when this person transitions. So
right.
Renee, I thank you so much for being on the podcast to share. Is there anything else you'd like to share before we wrap up?
I will just share with the audience. So, if you or someone you know has a legal matter, whether it be here based in the United States or abroad, whether it be a legal matter that crosses more than one jurisdiction, know that a company like ours is equipped and ready to help. We understand these issues, we understand the nuances, and we have a full team in place to assist you beyond just legal matters. People can feel free to reach out to us for questions, international burial questions, real estate questions, questions with respect to birth certificates and death certificates, and those types of questions. We're here to help. And we also work closely with some consulate offices based here in the United States to get folks the help that they need.
Renee, thank you. So where can they find you?
You can visit us on our website. We're at www.caribbeanlegalsolutions.com. You can contact us via phone at 718-887-6141. or via WhatsApp because it's the Caribbean. So feel free to contact us via WhatsApp and any of our social media handles.
All right. Thank you so much, Renee. I mean, okay, a good part of the conversation is about wills and deaths, but I just love when we have as much information to make more informed decisions, you know.
Yes.
That is what we are trying to do, you know. I'm getting to the point where not only am I taking care of my kids, you know, you start having to take care of parents, you know,
Yes.
and a lot of us are in that place, or there are some segments of our audience that have their or parents are taking care of their parents or
Mm-hmm.
grandparents. So we're seeing these generational shifts in the management. So, you know, as long as we're giving the audience to help another member of the family do what they need to do, I'm happy about that.
Yes,
So
that's in
thank you for
mind.
being on the podcast. And as I love to say at the end of every show, walk good.